So I want to give a kind of an update, a perspective about individualized medicine. Obviously, genomics is a big anchoring point of that. And this is really about data. And of course, as you know, today, more than gold or oil, data is the most valuable resource. And of all data, medical data is the most valuable. In fact, on the dark net, the black market, it has a 5-fold greater value than personal financial credit data. So it's quite valuable. And we are at a point that we can generate data about human beings at an unprecedented scale. And that's just going to continue as we go forward. So what's interesting is the consumer genomics has really taken off. I'm not sure exactly why, because we have now, as of the end of last year, over 12 million, approaching 13 million people who have had a consumer genomic package of one kind or another. How many here have had 23andMe or Ancestry.com? Yeah, almost everyone. The value of that data is a little questionable because the output is not much, but there's certainly a more keen interest than ever, and it really exploded in the latter months of last year with all sorts of holiday discounts. And it's becoming mainstream. This is Fast Company's article in the current issue about consumer genomics. And then in Wired, what's really interesting is the apparent recognition of the value of your data. So now all these companies have sprung up that will take your genomic data and put it on blockchain. And there are actually 9 of them, and of these, most of them are genomics, pure genomics companies. And so you get a token. I'm not sure how much that's worth either, but you basically are selling your data so that it can be used for other things, such as, for example, biopharma company advantage. So this is a really interesting new trend. All these have cropped up in very recent months. Well, for those of you who have not followed the blockchain, this is the Scientific American simple explanation of what it is. And this doesn't even include all of that article. This is a recent article. It's obviously very confusing, and people seem to kind of liken it to just Bitcoin. It's obviously far different because it's a template for a digital ledger. Whether or not genomic data and whether or not consumers will eventually use this for their medical data remains uncertain. It's in the earliest stages. But what is very clear is that we are really dumbed down in medicine today. And that's well highlighted by our approach to mass screening. So there's this thing, as you all know, of Bayes' theorem, which is defied by how we do mass screening. We take all people and we put them through screening rather than people at higher risk. And as you know, that by defying that theorem, you're going to generate, it's a machine for false positives. So what you can see is schematically, the benefit in these people who have mass screening is very marginal, very minimal. And if you actually take the data and look at it carefully, this is what you have. And it's really striking that if you look at for mammography, which is still routine, and particularly the prototypic are women at age 50 for 10 years, and over 6,000 women will have false positives over that course of a decade. And only 5 lives will be saved. Now, if that, of course, was a drug, it would never be approved. And the same is the case for PSA screening, which, even though it's not recommended any longer for routine screening, it's being used routinely for screening. And you see very similar data. So the question is, how are we going to get over this defiance of Bayes' theorem? And Ollie put together with our group a fantastic review article in Cell called High Definition Medicine. And that's really what is the current opportunity. That is the ability to really understand each human being, their medical essence, in an unprecedented, granular fashion. So what's really interesting is the recognition in this 10 breakthrough issue of MIT Tech Review that just came out a few days ago. This is, every year they rank the 10 top breakthroughs. And what's interesting this year is as you can see by the cover, it was genetic forecasting, fortune telling. And what were they talking about there? Well, actually genetic risk scores. And genetic risk scores are on the move right now. And even though consumer genomics had, 10 years ago, actually November 2007 was when 23andMe got it off the ground. So 10 years plus later, we finally can work with that data. And this idea of fortune telling sounded very questionable, and in fact went through all sorts of issues with the FDA and shutting down 23andMe. But things have changed now, and we can do a lot better. So these are just some of the conditions where a genetic risk score has emerged. And these are obviously very common and important conditions, and all of them, except Alzheimer's, are highly actionable. And the point on this slide is that we have a whole bunch of loci and even more variants within those loci. And we have a percent of heritability, which is fairly appreciable, but that obviously is at the population level. Some people may have 90% heritability from their genetic burden, risk score, or variant. So what we want to do is understand at the individual level. So this is just 1 week of publications of genetic risk scores. And as I say, it's really taking off, and I want to just drill down on some of these. This is for prostate cancer. And what you're going to see in these risk scores is that when you get into the high risk zone of this aggregation of multiple risk variants. This is aggressive prostate cancer, the only one which is really important, and it's a very uncommon form of prostate cancer. And we can pick out the people who really have particularly high risk. This is for type 2 diabetes, and again, you can see that the people in the highest group had a considerably higher risk for developing type 2 diabetes over time. This is Alzheimer's, and although there's no prevention or treatment, there's obviously still lots of work being done to try to affect this condition. Even chronic obstructive lung disease has been approached, which is surprising because we know so much of that is environmental related to smoking. And then the most important, of course, the one that's furthest along at this point is heart disease. This is coronary artery disease. It's still, although marginally more than cancer, the #1 killer today. And this is really important because we now can predict with reasonable assurance of people who are at higher risk. And I think this is something that's not being used, although it's obviously information that could be quite valuable to certain individuals. What is especially important here is how actionable it is. So you see 3 very large cohorts, and what is the effect of having a high risk score? This is with some 50 genetic variants. And you see that the lifestyle, that is as far as exercise, diet, weight, the lifestyle that's favorable titrates the risk in a striking fashion. And it's consistent across all these different cohorts. So the point #1 is that if you know your risk score, it should be even a higher inducement to reduce that risk because lifestyle makes a big difference. And for all of us to advocate the same lifestyle for everyone, well, these are the people who derive the most benefit. And now, just last month, there was a much bigger, over 500,000 people, now with over 80 loci, over 100 some variant. So this is even more crisply defined. So the risk score could even be updated from what has been used in recent publications to this one. So it's actually really mature at this point and has, I think, quite a bit of value. And it is really striking, especially when you note that when you look at the highest risk of these risk scores, you equate with monogenic disorders. So for example, with the heart disease risk score, when you look at the highest risk, you have the same or even higher risk than familial hypercholesterolemia. And the same for breast cancer, you have a higher risk or equivalent to BRCA1 or 2. So this is what, of course, is amazing to see at polygenic risk scores that are starting to get at an equivalence of these very rare or relatively rare but important monogenic conditions. And this is the one for obesity, and we know of some rare variants for obesity, but now we can see a polygenic risk score, which again can get to that level of risk. Now, one of the most interesting parts of this is the use of statins. So statins are one of the most widely prescribed and taken medications. And what's interesting is most people still are not in touch with the effect of statins. That is, most people take statins for primary prevention. And the biggest trial with the most potent statin is this trial Jupiter, which is depicted here with rosuvastatin or Crestor. And if you look at the curves, you see the effect. So how many people per 100 benefited from Crestor in this trial? How many? Two. 2 per 100 benefited over the course of 5 years. 98 people didn't benefit, taking the drug every day with much better LDL results on their lab tests, but no clinical efficacy. This is the other large trial, HOPE, schematically shown here. And you see how many people out of 1,000 derived benefit? 13. 13. 987 didn't benefit. This is statins that people take every day for the rest of their life for primary prevention. This is not the story for people who already have had heart or vascular disease. So when you look at the risk score for statins, it's actually, again, very striking. The people with the highest risk score in these various trials shown in red had a striking reduction in their risk. And in fact, what's interesting, even in one of the trials, the people in the low risk group of the risk score didn't have any benefit, actually went in the other direction. So why aren't we using this data to help people decide whether they should take a statin or not? If they are at very low risk, maybe they should, and they're marginal otherwise, they have no other risk factors, maybe they would not have to take a statin for the rest of their life. So Ali and the group at our place developed MyGeneRank, which is a mobile app where you can download your 23andMe, and I guess you can also download ancestry data, and you can put it into the app and you get an immediate coronary risk score. I was particularly chagrined to do this myself to find out I was in 92nd percentile, as depicted here. And so I've taken a statin, and now, of course, that really had a significant influence. It's under a research protocol. This is not obviously FDA approved. This is free once you have your data from a gene chip, but I think it might be useful, and certainly the hope is that we'll see other polygenic risk scores put into this MyGeneRank app over time. And Evan Musin, our group, did a similar study, which will soon be published on atrial fibrillation, prospectively assessing the risk of atrial fibrillation. Again, this is actionable because if you know you have a high genomic burden, you may want to avoid alcohol binges and other triggers for atrial fibrillation. So this is, I think, another really interesting study that will be coming out soon. And one of the questions is, well, are there randomized trials of genetic risk scores? And there is just one, and it isn't for endpoints. It was for LDL lowering. But for people that were given their genetic risk score as compared to those who weren't, they had a significant reduction as seen in this study, a Mayo Clinic study that was published earlier in this year. So it does seem to help at least some people. Now, one of the problems we have with risk scores and everything in genomics is the problems of probability. We don't think probabilistically, and we don't have enough training in school. And this is a fascinating study done by Amos Tversky that was written up in the Undoing Project, Michael Lewis's book. I thought was pretty instructive. So I did a large survey of Stanford oncologists and patients, and they were asked to choose an operation for patients with terminal cancer. So choice number one was a 90% chance of survival. And interestingly, 82% selected this one. Then they asked if the operation had a 10% chance of dying. Only 54% selected that one. So that kind of sums up our understanding of probability and our difficulties going forward in genomics. Now, one of the other really interesting turning points in genomics is cancer, a genomic disease, and the fact that we might be able to diagnose cancer at the earliest possible time. So you'll remember, those of you who were here 3 years ago, Eunice Lee presented. She was the actual very first person to present that when she had a non-invasive prenatal test, she found to have cancer, tumor DNA in that sample, and later had a workup that revealed she had colon cancer. She had a laparoscopic operation to remove the colon cancer, gave birth to her baby Benjamin, and it's done extremely well. But we have not diagnosed non-pregnant people with cancer yet from tumor DNA in the plasma. But there's hope for that. And that hope of being able to diagnose not just tract tumors, which is starting to get much more popular these days with a liquid biopsy in the plasma tumor DNA, but just last week in Science was the CancerSeq study from Johns Hopkins. That's really pretty striking because here in a blood sample, single tube, 61 variants and 31 protein panel was developed to look for cancer. This is retrospective. It's now going prospective in 50,000 people to see if it can pick up early detection of cancer. But what's interesting in this retrospective study is that even people with stage 1 cancer, there was some 40% ability to detect that, no less a very high rate in stage 2. So before, it really was metastatic or widely metastatic. So this is encouraging. This combination, not just relying on gene variants in the plasma, but also looking at various proteins like CEA and many others. So this is a test that can be done, Johns Hopkins folks say, for less than $500. And if it picks up cancer before it would ever be seen through a scan, and it also, by the way, through machine learning, informatics determines the origin of the cancer. So there doesn't have to be a mystery of where it came from, because you may remember from Eunice Lee, she had to have multiple MRIs to figure out that it actually was her colon that was the source of the cancer. So what's also interesting in Science last week was organoids. That is, taking the cancer and growing cells in culture and then testing it. This is really a great template for individualized medicine. And what was especially important about this study, it was the first validation that it actually made a difference in people in terms of their outcomes of their cancer treatment. So that was a big step forward. People were doing organoids in cancer, but it never really validated that it made a difference for the patients. Now, this whole idea of genomics all across the lifespan is really, I think, noteworthy. It's not at any one point, it's many points along the way. So you heard from Amy and Riley this morning about how sick children and babies can be benefited. And in fact, we're very lucky here in San Diego with Rady's Genomic Institute now having sequenced about 500 babies and have saved many lives, no less have helped with rendering specific treatment for many of these babies. But beyond sick newborns, children, there's a consideration they should be routinely sequenced. Those who have epilepsy, autism, developmental delay, undiagnosed diseases. And this is something that's practiced widely in certain centers around the country, like at Geisinger. And this Geisinger model continues because they have now sequenced, exome sequenced, over 100,000 individuals, and they plan to sequence actually up to 500,000 of their patient population. And they've been leading the charge in getting the data back to each of their patients in their system. No other health system that we know of is doing that, and it really is a whole new path potentially for the future. Pathogen, you'll hear more about that later in the conference, about a new way to approach infectious disease through sequencing, rapid sequencing of the pathogen. We just talked about cancer. And then, of course, one of the programs that we've been very active with here has been sequencing people with sudden death, where there's, at a relatively young age, where there's no explanation at autopsy. And molecular basis for that sudden death is very important for the family, as you can imagine, and we hope that it will become routine someday. So in the current issue yesterday of Science Translational Medicine, there's a very nice perspective paper about sensors. So far to this point, I've been talking largely about genomics, but I think it's naive to think that DNA is the center of everything. In fact, to understand each individual, we need to go much further than a person's sequence. And sensors are a way to understand the physiome of each individual. And of course, the sensor proliferation, not just wearables, but things in the home and elsewhere in the environment are proliferating and getting more and more validation over time. But what the question really goes forward is, what are we going to do with all this data? We got data coming out from all the different omics and sensors and scans. How are we going to deal with this? And obviously, the answer that has now come up is to use neural networks and artificial intelligence to be able to process this data in a meaningful way at scale. Because there's nothing that humans can do. This is where machines really come in handy. So this whole field of AI in imaging was validated 5 years ago by a classic paper from the University of Toronto group, Geoffrey Hinton. This was the deep learning when it took off. That is the ability to look at labeled images and to be able to machine with remarkable accuracy interpret these very carefully detailed annotated images. And so that set the stage for what the coming together of 4 big things to make AI such an important area today and what it will play in the future of genomic and individualized medicine. Labeled big data, like the ImageNet data set, which has some 15 million images that are carefully annotated. Interestingly, the gaming industry, and it was these graphic processing units from companies like NVIDIA that really, ironically, has helped bring deep learning AI to its current state. The necessity of having cloud computing to handle all of the storage, and then these open source modules to develop AI algorithms and be able to work with the data, such as TensorFlow. So there's a lot of hype on AI. When you see these ads from IBM Watson, you start to realize that this thing is overhyped. And this is, you've seen this ad, every time I see it, I get indigestion. I can read 5,000 new medical studies a day and still see patients. Well, guess what? You can't. You can't read any studies. What you might be able to do is read a few key words, but machines can't read, okay? They can't read. They can't understand. They, in fact, that's why we have to have data janitors to deal with the records and text, because that's something machines can't do. But don't tell IBM Watson that, because it's highly intelligent. Now, the area that's gotten another, probably the peak output of AI is driverless cars. And interestingly, just this week, California announced it's going to allow licensing driverless cars imminently. So that's moving fast. There's no question about it. But you know, it too has undergone a lot of hype about that we're just going to have driverless cars take you everywhere, anytime. And it turns out that's not really possible. So there are the levels of driverless cars by the Society of Automation Engineers. And full automation, level 5, means that under every condition, the machine is in charge. There's no human backup. So this is, of course, not possible because there are conditions like rain and fog and all sorts of things that would not allow that. But also, the question is, how does medicine come into play when we have all this data, whether it be the aggregate of genomic and sensors and on and on. And it really doesn't appear that it's possible we would ever get past level 3, the necessity of having clinician interface with patients, because this is not something, except for potentially very routine things, that would be done in a doctorless environment. But there are some things that that are really remarkable progress of AI in medicine, particularly pertinent to genetics. And one of them is the diagnosis of congenital diseases through a facial recognition app This is used today by most medical geneticists, taking a picture of the child's face and getting a pretty accurate diagnosis. In many cases, interestingly, these are children who hadn't been diagnosed for years, that with a simple processing of a facial picture through the app got an accurate diagnosis. This is deep learning as applied to genetics. Now, this is going much further than genetics. This is the Stanford study, perhaps the best one performed to date, comparing machine deep learning of skin cancer lesions versus 21 Stanford dermatologists, and it was at least as good in the accurate diagnosis of these skin lesions. It's also extended to many different eye conditions. This is diabetic retinopathy, where machine detection of retinopathy was at least as accurate, if not more, than ophthalmologists. And then recently, electrocardiograms, the same sort of thing, where deep learning of electrocardiograms were better than through a cardiologist or a series of cardiologists. And this is also extended to pathology. So when there's digital pathology, there's the opportunity to use machine learning. And this, again, is as good as or better than pathologists. Now, one of the interesting applications that that was, of course, from the physician-doctor side and machines, but what about the consumer side? What about the idea that machine learning could help your diet, tailor your diet? And this is interesting work from the Weizmann Institute from Israel, Aaron Siegel and Aaron Elenov. And they have a book, that, if you're interested, that just came out in December called The Personalized Diet. Multiple cell papers capped off by a paper in yesterday's Nature. This is the interesting observation that if we give the exact same amount of food, the same exact plate of food to different individuals, that each has a unique response as far as their glucose in response to that food intake. And this individual response, no one has really understood the basis for it until the work that they did, which now has superseded this initial publication in Cell, which was a couple of years ago, where they did about 800 people. Now they've done well over 2,000, perhaps even up to 3,000 people, where they gave diet, they did the microbiome, they did continuous glucose, and they determined what were the driving factors for this glucose response. And in fact, the accompanying editorial was, "Siri, what should I eat?" Probably wouldn't be Siri, but anyway, we'll get to that in a second. So I decided I would like to test this thing because it sounded really interesting. So I did it, and I had my glucose assessed continuously for 2 weeks with some spikes that was concerning to me, shown in red. I had my gut microbiome, and I went through the laborious process of recording everything I ate and drank, sleep, exercise, medications. I mean, this was a real pain in the neck for 2 weeks. But the output was interesting, because then I got a personalized diet. And it's actually quite remarkable, because everything, and it was sobering, because some of my favorite foods got a D rating, you know. But some of the things I don't like at all got A+. So, you know, maybe you don't want to know this stuff. But what's interesting is you can get your glucose in a very tight range and avoid spikes. Now, is that really valuable for the rest of your life? I don't know, but it's really provocative, really provocative. And not only that, but all this output, now they have a massive database where I can just search any food, and I can find out what happened with me, because they have such a broad experience. And so it really goes on to everything, snacks, beverages, I mean, you name it. Okay, this is the paper they published yesterday. And what's fascinating about this is the microbiome, the gut microbiome, drives the glucose response. So that wasn't really known before. It was thought, well, maybe it's the DNA, the genome, or who knows what. But that is what's driving a lot of different phenotypes. And it's really, the gut microbiome is determined by environment rather than through one's DNA. So that was a really interesting paper just published yesterday. Well, we have some problems in AI in medicine. And I just would point out that a lot of these papers have only been published in preprints. Some of them have had top-tier peer review, but the biggest problem we have right now, because I've tried to review some of the best studies, is that none of them have had a clinical validation, not a single one. What I mean by that is, it's nice to have a machine learning, deep learning study where you go retrospective in silico, but what you have to do is take that and go forward and prove that it works in people. And none of these studies have been. So we're in the earliest phases of the AI and medicine world. And in order to do that, we have to go from this whole concept of publishing to which we haven't seen enough of in peer review. A lot of articles are published in a preprint platform, and they don't even bother. And when I've asked the investigators, I said, well, why don't you publish it in a peer-reviewed journal? They said, well, we did have it peer-reviewed on Twitter. I said, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. That's not peer review. Okay, so we need to have it validated in the real world, and we also, of course, want to see it implemented. And so, again, we're still at this very first phase of this AI in medicine, but there's a lot of potential promise. So what I want to just kind of finish up on is this area of democratization, the individual driving their care, because of having their data, this enables people. And there's a whole new attitude in healthcare today, and exemplified by this little video segment.
Miss Kelly, the doctor will see you now.
Can you let the doctor know that I'll be with him shortly?
Huh?
I am getting a lot of work done. Your Wi-Fi is very fast.
But he's ready for you now.
I'll be with him as soon as I can.
Is she ready?
Not yet, but you're next.
Okay. So with that, one of the things that has to happen if we're going to be able to move forward is that people have to own their data. Because if you don't own your data, you're never going to have real AI of your data, because if it's incomplete, it's kind of like a garbage in story. So that is only one of the many reasons you should own your data. The fact is that you pay for it, it's your body, and 25 other things that I enumerate here, it even could save your life. And we don't, essentially, no one has all their medical data. And it should be from birth or even prenatal all the way through one's life, all the different types of data, including sensors and the traditional electronic medical records, genomics, and on and on. It should be all yours and in one place. And that's the only way we can really jump forward. And we don't have anything close to that at this point. Now, we are very much involved with this study that last year Eric Dishman was here and presented the All of Us. This is the Precision Medicine Initiative that was introduced by President Obama, actually in the January 15 State of the Union address that he gave. And he was very passionate about this. Fortunately, it's gone forward and has funding for many, many years going forward. And it's a million American study, which is ongoing with some 25,000 or so participants already joined. We are running the so-called participant center at Scripps Research. And this is one of the major parts of the whole initiative. Basically, Vanderbilt runs the data center, Mayo Clinic runs the biobank. There's lots of different health systems, HBOs that are part of this, that are enrolling, and we are helping to pull this together for things like mobile apps and privacy security and engagement, which obviously is a long-term story in a study which will probably go on for many decades. We're very lucky we have lots of different partners that are helping us. That is making this convenient for people to be able to enroll in places like a Walgreens retail clinic, and also being able to find people, particularly underrepresented minorities, which we're really striving to enroll in this study. So we're very grateful having so many great, terrific partners. Now, as it turns out, we want to have all the different layers of data to be able to do this right. So in order to do individualized medicine, you can't just have a whole genome sequence or just sensors. You need to have as much data as possible. And so that whole layers of information is something to strive for in the future. And there's only in the beginning of the recognition that culling all this data together is essential. And I'll just cite a few examples. Sophia Genetics, I only learned about recently, is a Swiss company. It's been around for several years, but now they are doing combined AI for sequencing, liquid biopsy, and medical imaging. And they actually have a pretty large number of people that patients they've worked on throughout Europe and some other places. So this is the beginning, but now, interestingly, is this group, this company called Tempus Labs. And this is interesting because the fellow who started Groupon, of all people, Eric Lefkowski, his wife developed breast cancer. They live in Chicago. And he decided, he and his wife decided that after they did a survey of what was available to help his wife, that there was nothing available that was acceptable. So he decided to build his own company, Tempus Labs. And later, I guess he bought the Montgomery Ward's department store in downtown Chicago, which is where Tempus Labs and Groupon are housed. And this is quite remarkable because they do natural language processing of the electronic record data, as well as whole genome sequencing of the tumor of the patient, RNA sequencing of the tumor, liquid biopsy. All the sequencing is done in-house. Immunosequencing, machine learning of the scans, organoid culture of the tumor cells, and they even have started digital twinning, which is finding other people in their database, which is now tens of thousands of people. They have a contract with over 40 national comprehensive, NCI comprehensive centers, cancer institutes, that is. And so this is really a step in the right direction, but it's for cancer specifically. This Chinese company has got the right idea. They're bringing all the data together, and they have almost $1 billion equivalent of US investment. I don't know if it's going to work, but the whole idea is to get all of the data for each human being to be able to prevent conditions, to be able to come up with better treatments than we have today, to be able to take advantage of other members of our species, to learn from them, to have a true learning system. So this is where I think we're ultimately headed. And that is this deep learning of all these different layers. And that includes the entire corpus of the medical literature constantly being updated, and every one of these layers of information about each person. And once you have that through a deep learning neural network, then you can have a virtual coach, as well as, of course, a clinician, help guide someone. And that could be through Alexa or a voice assistant, a smart voice speaker as today. How many of you have an Alexa device or Google Home here? Interesting, not as many have had consumer genomics, okay. So they're immensely popular. I think you know they are tracking, like with smartphones, to be almost 25% adoption in the first 2 years since they've been out. Largely that's a market that's dominated by Alexa and Amazon, but others, of course, are vying for acceptance. You have a picture here of what I think is the future. Rather than speaking to a cylinder, I mean, I know some of our people in our group have multiple Alexa devices in their home, but I wonder the appeal of talking to a cylinder. And when I was recently in New Zealand, I visited this company that's very creative called Soul Machines. And I think this is where the future is, and no longer will we be talking to cylinders. So they have 3D virtual humans. These are a couple. And I know it may look a little creepy, but they are really interactive. Now, why do I say that? Because you'll see here, this one has audio.
Hello, my name is Rachel. I am an expert on soul machines. I can talk to you about any of these topics. I connect with you in a human-like way by sensing your reactions and responding emotionally. Wouldn't you rather speak to me than a faceless chatbot? Soul Machines uses neural networks to give me a virtual nervous system, so I can learn and react in real time. A virtual nervous system is an interconnected model of aspects of the human brain. It combines different neural systems to enable me to behave in a way that's inspired by biology.
So with that, let you think about it for a while. I just want to stop there and thank all the great people I have a chance to work with at our place, and thanks a lot for your attention. Okay.